Hello, everyone, and welcome to Northern Shield Resources live event. I'm pleased to introduce their president and CEO, Ian Bliss, who will take us through a presentation followed by a Q&A session. So I encourage you to participate. Just as a reminder, you can submit your questions on the Q&A chat on the right-hand side of your screen at any point during the conversation. If we don't have time for the questions, Ian can reach out to you personally, but I think we will have enough time today as it's just a brief update on the recent press releases. As always, the summit is being recorded and will be available on six.com to watch afterwards. So without further ado, I'll kick things over to you, Ian, to start things off.
Thanks very much, Kyle, and good afternoon, everyone. This is a presentation really on our last press release and the work that culminated just a few weeks ago. But I'll start with a brief introduction to Northern Shield and the Root and Cellar property. Our flagship project is the Root and Cellar property on the Burin Peninsula of Newfoundland. The original mineralization was discovered by a local prospector, but has never seen methodical exploration by a junior mining company. The property is being explored for epithermal gold and porphyry copper type mineralization. Porphyry copper and epithermal gold are really end members of the same system, so occasionally you can find them on the same project site. Recent work at the Root and Cellar property too suggests the system is what we call an alkaline related epithermal gold system. This is important because alkaline related systems have the unique characteristic of often being very high grade gold and large tonnage deposits. Cripple Creek, Colorado, Porgera, Papua New Guinea, and Emperor and Fiji are just examples of alkaline driven systems. And if this is an alkaline-driven system, I think this is the first one noted as such in Eastern Canada. And they're also important because they're often associated with considerable tellurium mineralization, which is now a critical metal, and I think something that we'll be hearing a lot more about in the coming months and coming years. So we have 5 gold zones over about a 6-kilometer strike length within the Root and Cellar property, and several copper zones. The biggest is in the southwest of the property with grab samples of up to about 10% copper. But the real focus this year and the past few years has been what we call the Conquest Zone. That's in the center of the property. Its footprint itself between the grab samples of rock from surface plus the soil samples is about 1 by 1 kilometer. So quite a large footprint. The Conquest Zone is really in the dead center of the Root and Cellar property, and it's hosted within a very distinct volcanic complex. We announced early this week the results from a trenching program, which was really centered back in the southwest corner of the Conquest Zone. This background image is of the IP chargeability that we completed on the project in 2021 and again in 2023. And this is a near surface sort of a depth slice, so it's right at surface. And generally what you see is a compilation of these anomalies in the southern Conquest Zone that more or less trend east-west. The gold-bearing boulders that we found late last year and early this year on the eastern portion of that, those were running up to 111 grams per ton. And based on the ice direction, which is sort of from the northwest to the southeast, the source for these boulders is likely up in this area here, or certainly somewhere along a trajectory of this line heading to the west-northwest. And we believe for several reasons it's in this area here. So the recent work, the press release of earlier this week focused on the trenching that we really did in the western portion of the Conquest Trend. So we have about 8 samples that so far we've identified visible gold in. Some of it's quite fine, but there's quite a lot of grains. Some of them are coarser. But obviously, anytime you're seeing visible gold, it's a very important factor. So, this was the last week of field work was really a great culmination of the field work we've been undertaking this entire year, where we really had to go back to the drawing board a little bit, get our heads down and try to understand the geology and the structure. And that all came together in this past week's worth of work. So, the exciting point was obviously discovering the visible gold in outcrop this time. We still haven't found the source of these boulders yet, but visible gold in outcrop here. Those were all found over about, within 30 meters of each other. So again, quite a considerable footprint of the visible gold in the Western Conquest Zone. But not only did we find the visible gold, the important thing is we see north-south trending structures, which I'll get into a little bit more on the next slide, as well as the east-west. So we see the north-south cutting structures cutting the east-west. Not only the structures, we see quartz veins sitting within those structures. Both those quartz vein sets are mineralized. And so we see the VG, we see the structures that over the past year, we've been coming to the conclusion that the north-south trending IP anomalies at depth are the important ones. And we see that now on the surface structures, along with some incredible alteration and textures in these rocks that indicate that, we're at the high levels of low sulfidation epithermal gold system. I say not only importantly we find those structures, but we see that they match the IP both on surface and at depth. So this is a surface expression of the IP generally trending east-west from about 0 meters of surface to about 40 meters depth. And so here's a general outline. And now if we go down a little bit deeper, we zoom right in here, the outcrop we found, the VG in the past week, and the general trend of the surface anomalies is east-west. But now we're looking about at an 80-meter depth slice. And quite clearly, you can see the east-west IP anomalies have disappeared, but we start picking up the north-south. And it's right above that we start seeing these north-south structures in the outcrop that we just trenched, including carrying visible gold in both sets. You can see on this image to the left, here's the outcrop. It generally trends east-west. And so we're kind of looking at it from the north, looking south, if you go back to that IP image. And so you can clearly see here, these north-south structures cutting the outcrop, which in itself sits in an east-west trend. So again, we've seen these structures on surface outside of this area that are weakly mineralized, and now we see it carrying what we think is the high-grade mineralization. I say this trend here matches the deeper IP. So on surface, what's happening is these fluids are coming up, and there's about 40 meters of, we'll call it cap rock, that not much of the north-south structure is penetrating. It's penetrating in a few places, obviously right here. But near the surface, that mineralization leaks into these east-west structures. And that's why we see it trending east-west on surface, and the IP trends east-west. But at depth, and we think this is a principal target, and it's a very large one, 300 or 400 meters in strike length, and actually probably continues 1,000 plus meters to the north. We believe we have parallel sets on either side. But we've always said, since we remodeled the IP, that we believe these north-south trending structures are the important features. And so we see that now on surface where we see them, and they're heavily mineralized. So, in this area, some of the structure is penetrating to surface, and then it continues at depth where clearly blows out. And so we'll be targeting in the upcoming drill program, starting shortly after Labor Day, we hope, we'll be targeting the near surface mineralization here, and then slowly tracking it down into these deeper north-south trending features. So just to go on to look at a little bit of a rock shot here, and again, this really summarizes what we see on surface in the outcrop. Here's one set of veins. This is actually what we call coliform crustiform banded vein, indicative of a low sulfidation system. Here's, I'd say, a more normal vein in the other direction. So in this one rock sample, we see these two different orientations of veins, and they're both, as you can see, mineralized. And this one's classic coliform crustiform, so it's a low sulfidation system. We don't see a lot of these coliform banded veins, and there's two possible reasons for that. Number one, alkaline-driven systems tend to be more associated with silicification, which you can see in this background image, highly silicified, brecciated, lots of pyrite. But alkaline systems tend to be associated with silicification rather than quartz veinings. But the textures we see here, only a handful of coliform bands, plus we see other textures like banded calcite, tell us we're very high, we're at shallow depths in the epithermal system. We're just on the very top of the boiling zone. It's the boiling zone which carries your high-grade gold mineralization. And we tell this, I say, by the abundance or lack of abundance of colorful veining and other features, but it's strongly suggested that we're at the very upper levels of the boiling zone. And so the fact that we're seeing so much visible gold already at the top of the boiling zone makes us very, very curious and interested to get to the drill program and see a little bit deeper down and try to drill into the heart of the boiling zone. So if we're seeing a lot of gold right now at the top of the boiling zone, we expect to see some pretty nice grades once we get into the heart of that system. So, this was, part of the excitement. Of course, everybody likes visible gold, but it's seeing all these structures and textures in the rock that tell us we're getting really close to the heart of the system. And even the prospector, when grabbing the sample, started to notice the increase in potassium mineralization as an alteration mineral. The closer we got to that center, as we got right above that north-south trending IP target, we'll go back to that image. As soon as we started moving in here, we started picking up more and more potassium in the quartz veins. And again, the potassium is showing your hotter portion of your fluid conduits, and obviously that's where your better gold grades are going to be carried to. And so it's a very exciting culmination of the field season. So we put our heads down throughout the field season trying to understand these structures, and it all sort of came together in this one outcrop. We also did trenching over here to follow up on some reasonable good grades, 8 grams per ton for previous work. We'll go back and start trenching in the area of the other VG bearing boulders, or where we think they're sourced from, along with incorporating that into our upcoming drill program. So, very exciting into the surface work of the field season, and now we head into the drill program. But obviously, finding outcrop like this along with the VG gives you great confidence going into the drill program. So that's a sort of a summary of where we are and what we press released earlier this week, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Ian. We did have some pre-submitted questions, but just as a reminder to the people attending live that there is a Q&A feature in the bottom right hand of your screen, so feel free to ask your questions there. First pre-submitted question here. Northern Shield has spent much of the summer mapping, sampling, completing geophysics, etc. All the unglamorous work that tends to get no love in the markets. But judging based off the market's response to your news earlier this week, the hard yards have paid off. Can you speak on that?
Yeah, actually, it's a good question, and it relates back to the panel discussion I was on earlier this week. We're talking about the asymmetric upside of early stage exploration projects and trying to get in at the ground floor. This panel was hosted by Matthew Micklebrough on Tuesday. And you're correct. Generally, especially in these markets, junior mining companies get very little response or very little love to this type of news of geophysics mapping and grab sampling, but it's all important. And to get to where we are today, you must put in the hard yards and build up knowledge on the targets. And I say we've had our heads down the past year doing that, and that gives us a lot of confidence going into the drill program. But no matter how boring the news releases are in such program, not only do we use that, but astute investors of today still pay attention to it. So we don't always get the market reaction we want, and perhaps we can't blame investors for that. But I say more and more you're seeing astute investors, obviously paying attention to this type of news flow in the background, whether it's through news releases or medias like this. They're paying attention to it, and so not only are we building up our knowledge on the project during this time frame, so are they. And so when we bring out news like we did on Tuesday, they have the full context of it, and I think that's why the market responded the way it did, even in really tough markets. It responded the way it did because I think over the past years, some of our shareholders have been following this closely and have a context of what this press release means in discovering the gold and the textures that we saw in outcrop. So they were following this, the project over the summer and doing their homework and building knowledge. And everyone wants to be an investor in a pre-discovery stage, before that meteoric rise in the Lassonde curve. But that discovery stage is no longer a finite line like it used to be perhaps 20 or 30 years ago, where you kind of learned about a discovery either every 2 weeks through the Northern Miner or the odd press release, but you often did not see it coming. And so if you're lucky enough to jump in and call your broker, you got in relatively low, but that was a little bit of a gamble on itself. And now, at least with companies putting out regular press releases on their work and channels like this, they can follow the story during this sort of unglamorous phase, and investors can gain comfort with the story and ask questions along the way. So when that the news comes out that maybe the good news, they can understand it better, and so they're de-risking it as much as they can too, in a high risk but high reward sector. So there's no doubt luck is involved in this sector too, but after a summer of detective work, it is very rewarding from our point of view to see the pieces of the puzzle come together. And I think shareholders can also pick up on the excitement that management exhibits when all this begins to come together, so the fruits of the labor. And I can tell you, when I was down in Marystown at Root and Cellar this past week, it was hard to pry the prospector away from the microscope because of what we were seeing in the rocks. And say it wasn't just the VGs; it was all the textures and the retridation. And then I think I eventually had to bribe him with beer time so he can get away from the microscope so I can have a look. And I say we're excited, and we have a lot more confidence going into this drill program with what we see accommodating in this last week's worth of work.
Great. Now you can elaborate as much or as little on this question as possible, but what is the total size of Root and Cellar?
The total size, originally it was about 30 square kilometers. When we acquired it, we then staked a whole bunch of surrounding land, pushing up to about 300. We're now beginning, the last few years, downsizing it because we go and look at portions of that and sort of, I don't want to say sterilize it, but not so much of interest. And so now I think we're down to something on the order of 100 square kilometers. But it all comes back to that original land package put together by the prospector and a few other claims that we've added on since to this, what we call the center of it, which is where we get this volcanic complex. And that seems to be very different from the geology of the rest of the property. And so we think most of the interest is contained within that volcanic complex in the roughly 30-40 square kilometers that forms the core of the property. And that's within that we have, I say, five or 6 kilometers strike length of gold showings, of which most of the work has been on Conquest, with good reason as the results have shown this week with all the VG. But eventually we'll get back to some of these other targets. And just going back to that, when we found the VG in this relatively new area, it's where we found mineralization before, but not this amount of VG. Those boulders we found last year, as I say, based on the ice direction, they're from a different source. They're not far away. We can tell by the geology. It's part of this package, extremely close, within a few tens, a few hundred meters max of where the boulders were found. But the gold in those boulders too are slightly different. They're more in silicification, associated with a little bit of silica blebs and silica veins, but not the clear-cut veins that we saw in this lightly trench. So there's more visible gold to be found in bedrock, which is encouraging again. So there's obviously a lot of free gold in this system.
Right. Next question here. Just want to know the status on the money owed from Revenue Quebec.
Yeah, obviously I can't go into that in great detail, but as we released a month or so ago, the courts ruled in our favor in that decision. That allows us to go back to file on an objection with Revenue Quebec pertaining to 2017 and 2018 notice of assessments, which we did not receive and which denied us a tax credit. And so now we're going through that process very, very shortly of objecting. And the 2017 and 2018 notice of assessments or tax credits related to the same project. And we eventually again won a settlement on 2016. And now, so we'll start that same objection process on 2017 and 2018. How long it takes, that's really anybody's guess. We think it's going to be relatively, it won't be as long as 2016 because we know the procedures, we know our arguments. We've already, Revenue Quebec has already been through it, so I think it's going to be solved relatively quickly. But as we all know, it's sometimes easier. Revenue agencies like to collect their taxes more so than give it back. But we're going through the objection process as the court decision allowed.
Yeah, for sure. We have a question from the audience here. Can you comment about your evolving thinking about the copper potential and whether one or two of the upcoming holes will target a copper prospect?
One hole may target one of the copper targets. The big copper target is in the southwest, where we have, as I say, the exposures in the pits of indications of a copper porphyry system. That's where we get a lot of soil anomalies in copper. We get the tellurium, and we see these fragments being brought up in these breccia pipes. So we think underlying there is one of the main copper targets. But in the initial drill program in 2021, two of the drill holes hit, you could say minor copper mineralization, but meaningful in the end, particularly because we had 1 or 2 meters of 1% or just under 1% copper. But importantly, they're in these veins called B veins, which are very good indicators for copper porphyries. Now, at the time, we were just getting our heads around this everything about gold, and we didn't recognize the importance of these B veins, but clearly they're there. They carry copper, and not all B veins carry copper, even though they're still a vector towards copper porphyry mineralization. These ones carry chalcopyrite, a little bit of bonite. And interesting too, when we remodel the IP, we see these two drill holes that hit the copper mineralization along with strongly elevated tellurium. They just clip the sides of these IP anomalies, because at that time we were thinking they were going east-west. We now think they're going north-south. And so it's tempting to go back and drill, try to put one hole into this copper target. But it's a small program. And so it's either focusing all on the gold or perhaps taking a small amount of that and testing the copper target. But if we don't test it now, we will very shortly, because it's now that we sort of started bringing the copper porphyry potential into the fold and understanding it. Clearly, some of these drill holes are of importance with the presence of copper-bearing B veins and quite a nice IP target right next to it.
Great. Sorry, just addressing a comment in the chat. This will be recorded afterwards, so no worries if you trickle in a little late. We have one more question here, but as a reminder, continue to submit questions in the chat if you have any. But Root and Cellar was obviously your focus right now, but you also have quite an interesting nickel copper PG project in your portfolio, and I've been watching the comments on the chat site over the summer, and some shareholders are interested and wondering if you would go back to Idefix with the strong demand for good copper nickel projects. Is there any plans to go back there?
Yeah, it's this is a really neat project. Obviously, our focus right now is on Root and Cellar, especially with the recent discoveries of visible gold and the understanding we put together. But we've always liked the Idefix project. I think it's one of the better ones out there in Eastern Canada. And I know a lot of our shareholders have been start asking about it, obviously with the strong interest in the markets for nickel copper projects. And it was actually early on this year, we started reviewing a lot of the data pertaining to Idefix, both for our own good, and there was some interest in various entities acquiring this project. So in that review process, I mean, number one, it reminded us what a good project it was. There's some, quite spectacular PG values, as well as indications of massive sulfide nickel copper and a lot of disseminated mineralization. So reviewing that data kind of reminded what a good project it is, and also looking at it kind of fresh after 5-8 years of somewhat dormancy. You look at it a little bit differently. We haven't really been back since the airborne VTEM survey was run, and so some targets there we want to follow up on, and we had a few other ideas, as I say, when reviewing this data. So we're going to go back and have a quick look. We would have liked to have been back up during the summer, but helicopter availability precluded that. We're waiting for a helicopter to come available this fall, and I think one's going to come available imminently. And so we'll quickly run up there a couple of days and just follow up on some of these ideas that we've come across that we generated during this review process over the summer. So it's a really interesting project. It's like the focus now is obviously Root and Cellar, but it's a good project, and the timing is right now, I think, just to kind of test our ideas and see if there's more nickel copper PG mineralization up there, particularly in an area that we didn't test a lot back in 2013, 2014.
For sure. And going back to Root and Cellar, we have a couple more questions here. How close are you to earning 100% interest at Root and Cellar?
I think after this drill project, we would have met all our obligations, so we're extremely close right now. We'll find out at the end of this quarter when we file our financial statements, but we're extremely close. And I think after this drill project, we would have met our earning requirements. If not, it's extremely close. So I imagine by the end of this year, it would be 100% Northern Shield.
Great. And Mr. Coffin just joined a little late, so maybe it's a good opportunity to summarize your presentation today. He's wondering if there's other occurrences outside of Conquest where you see definitive colioform banding and or ginguro?
You see it scattered throughout the property, particularly mostly in the Conquest Zone. You get towards Drop Zone, you begin to see a little bit too. Certainly the alteration is somewhat similar. It's perhaps more as you go north to what I call the north flank of the volcanic complex. You start moving to more of an intermediate sulfidation system, so you tend to lose your classic ginguro and colorform banding. But we do, from what I can know, we see it generally a little bit in the Drop Zone, but I'll have to double check that. But most of it's in the Conquest Zone. But again, it's not as ubiquitous as it was, for instance, at our Shot Rock property in Nova Scotia, where we saw a lot of coliform, crustiform banding. Here we don't. We do see it. Clearly, we see it in some of these rocks. And I say that's, two reasons. Number one, we may be at the top of the boiling system where you're not, and above the boiling system, you're not going to get a lot of coliform, crustiform banding. Secondly, with alkaline systems, the mineralization tends to be more disseminated and associated with silicification rather than full-on veining. So we don't have the abundance of crustiform, coliform banding, but it is concentrated in the Conquest area, but not in that immediate area. I mean, we're talking still within this 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer block. And credit to the prospector again. I mean, we were beginning to doubt it was a low sulfidation system. We were beginning to lean towards more intermediate, but at the end of the day, it looks like it is low sulfidation, but an alkaline-driven system. So clearly, we have the coliform, crustiform veining, and I say the fact that we're seeing visible gold at the very, very top of the boiling system is pretty exciting because hopefully there's some spectacular grades just a little bit deeper.
Okay, great. Mr. Coffin just has a follow-up question. Assuming you get the cash, will you expand IP down toward the porphyry target and or Drop Zone?
Yes, I think certainly Drop Zone and the porphyry, like it's almost in the same belt. Depending on which way we fly the lines, we'd end up, or not flying lines, doing IP to cover both targets. So we do have one copper target already covered by the IP. We didn't, as I noticed it, until following up on the 2021 drill programs, and that's within the current Conquest IP survey. But the next step would be moving that survey to the west to cover the copper porphyry, and also eventually up to Braxton Bradley, which has a mixture of both high silver, low gold, high silver, tellurium, and some copper mineralization too. So we will be. But the next step after focusing on the Conquest gold would be to expand the survey westward for the main copper porphyry target and drop zone.
Great. Thank you, Ian, for updating all the people listening, and anyone that did come in late. Just a reminder, it will be available to recording probably by end of day here. So look out for that. You could even go through the same registration link and find it that way. We have one more question we better address here before we sign off. Can you expand on the significance of the tellurium references?
Yeah, I guess there's two sort of points to it. Number one is, it's a metal that's, it's a rare. Most of the world's tellurium comes right now as byproducts of copper and gold deposits in China. The main use for tellurium right now is in solar panels, and that's why it's now deemed a critical metal. And to say I don't believe there's a source in North America other than byproducts of now. I think it's Rio Tinto is processing copper sludge for some of their copper projects, extracting that tellurium. But it's a critical metal. It's a rare critical metal. It's used primarily in solar panels, but there is experimental lithium tellurium batteries, and adding the tellurium to the lithium increases the storage capacity 3 to 10 times. So yeah, there are a few engineering wrinkles in this, but once those are sorted out, obviously if you can increase the range of your Tesla, whatever, 3 to 10 times, some of these vehicles might become more attractive to buyers, especially in somewhere like Canada where we have a range problem. But it's a rare commodity. The only place you really find it is as a byproduct of alkaline-driven, gold, silver, and copper porphyry deposits. And so it's its presence itself is one of the characteristics that started pointing us in the direction saying, hey, this may be an alkaline-driven system, because you don't really get that much tellurium everywhere else. And then there's other characteristics too, but it was one of the key characteristics that pointed us in the direction of this being an alkaline system.
Ian, I'll let you have the closing remarks here, but it sounds like Eric's tipping his hat off to you, saying kudos to you and the team. It sounds like a complex system, not easy, and it takes perseverance to start cracking the code here. But with that, little hats off to you, and why don't you close us off for the evening?
Yeah, thanks very much, Eric. As I say, we do feel quite pleased now with everything culminating in this last week's worth of work. I think now these systems are complex. I think every gold deposit is. But now that we start to get our heads around it, things begin to make sense. You can have a big deposit like Hemlo, but you can still miss it in the first few drill programs. But we like what we see a lot in this outcrop. I say it's not just the gold; it's the textures, and we feel we got great confidence going into this drill program. The IP matches what we see there on surface. We're seeing a lot of gold, and I think the future is going to be very, very exciting.